Hi, everyone. I am Tanya Jenka, and I wrote a book called Alice and Bob Learn Application Security. And this stream is about Chapter 6, Testing and Deployment. The idea of these streams is that I wanted to basically give more content than just what was in the book, because there's a lot to say on each of these topics. So I invited friends along to a stream once a month to discuss each chapter of the book as we go through the months of 2021. And you can find the schedule, if you don't know about it, at aliceandboblearn.com. But without further ado, let's bring out my guest, Nikki Becker.
Hi. Hey, everyone. Hi, Tanya. Good to be here.
Thank you for coming, Nikki. I'm really excited to have you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
I was wondering if you could introduce yourself for our viewers who might not know you.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Nicole. Everyone calls me Nikki Becker. I've been in the cybersecurity space for, I guess, 15 years, working in all sorts of roles, offensive, defensive, management, and I sort of very passionate about the space. I co-host the OWASP DevSecOps show with Nancy. We stream live almost every weekend, maybe every other weekend. But yeah, I'm super passionate about the space. I love AppSec. I love security, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Yes, Nikki and I were part of the OWASP DevSecOps project together, and we met on the internet because she made an intentionally vulnerable app and it was broken, and I asked for help and she helped me. And then a beautiful friendship was formed. It's true, right?
It's true. And you made your deadline. I think you made your deadline that day.
I did. It was really good.
The internet can come through.
And so, yes, Kellen's like, the legend. That's right. Also, Kellen, you had shorter hair there in that picture. Okay, so on topic. Welcome everyone that's part of the stream that's listening in. Thank you for coming. And I was hoping, so this chapter is about testing and deployment. And very briefly, when we talk about testing in the book, we mean verifying the quality, the reliability, and the security of an application. And when we talk about deployment, we mean basically whatever the steps are that you do to release your application into production. And everyone has like different things that they do, and we're going to talk about that some. But I wanted to say, like, just define those up front so people aren't like, well, what about user acceptance testing? That's not a thing we're going to talk about here. We're going to focus specifically on like security and reliability, because reliability is part of security. And yeah, I was wondering, Nikki, there's so many different types of testing. Because like, oh, hi, Gary, hi, Ben. There's so many different types of testing. Do you have a favorite type or way or method or anything like that?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the blended approach is probably the most effective one. And I guess my favorite would be to like kind of sprinkle in a little bit of everything. I used to be a big fan of like, trying to do more dynamic testing. But I feel like maybe in recent times that's been a little bit less reliable. And maybe getting more value out of like code reviews or sort of static analysis testing is more sort of juice through the squeeze, or I think that's the analogy. You get more value out of doing those two types of tests. But yeah, I mean, I think that, the general benefit here is that, you have all this code, like, is it doing the things we want it to do? How do we have assurance around this, right? That's what we're really looking for. And there is like no perfect way to do this. I think we should be very clear about that, right? There's no like holy grail, I haven't found it, right? That like, just like wave a wand through your code base and like, oh, here's all the problems, fix them this way, and then you're magically totally secure. It is a very much iterative process of, you have to like really tackle this domain.
Oh, yeah. And I would say, so I get asked a lot, like, well, how do we know we're doing enough things? And like, how can we make sure we're perfect? And I'm like, well, you're not going to be perfect. Just ask, like the Microsoft security team who has like a bug bounty, and they have security researchers, and they have, like a million different steps that they do. And sometimes people still find stuff because they're such a huge target and the risk is really high versus, my company, SheHacksPurple, where like, yeah, we have a website and the website is dumb. It doesn't really do much. And like, the worst thing that could happen is someone could deface it. And like, so the risk is much lower there. And therefore people don't bother doing that much testing on our website or research or malicious looking at it, I guess I could say. But sorry, you.
No, I think you're right. I mean, you know, you have to put this in context, right? Like, what are you trying to protect? Like, there's all that, like, what am I trying to protect? Like, what kind of data is on this app? Do I care that much about it? Am I going to put like 100 hours of testing around a brochure website? Probably not. You know, and then there's also these like natural points, right? Where you probably want to drill in further. And I think in your book, you highlight those points like really well. Like, what are these layers where things could go wrong, right? Authentication, right?
Yeah.
Authorization, right? You know, how you manage sessions, how you manage identity and workflow identity or lifecycle identity through the application, how you look at input, like what are you taking in? What are you printing out or sending out, you know? I think that those are like these layers that, you know, we all probably have in most sort of large scale web applications or even small scale web applications. Those are really good places to start. And that, you know, I think another problem with like testing is like, it's this broad domain. Like, what do you mean? Like unit tests, integration tests, like security tests, like tests, like what am I supposed to really do here? Yeah. And I think, you know, to focus yourself on like good technical areas that like where risk can be introduced and like actually cause damage is probably a good place to start.
Yes. So we have a live audience watching. And so I kind of wanted to ask them which type of testing that they're interested in us talking about. And I'm going to give you kind of like a list, which I guess I'll try to read out. So like code review, static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, software composition analysis, unit tests, stress tests, performance tests, infrastructure as code, like policy scanning and such. Like there's just such a long list. Like, I just go on and on and on. Manual testing. Yeah.
That is a long list. Yeah, you're right. IAC testing. Yeah. I'm kind of a big fan of that lately though.
Fuzzing.
You know? Or yeah, fuzzing. That's it. That is technically testing.
I mean, like it can be a slow process, that's for sure. There is a message from Gary. So this is a great point for testing the important stuff. It's really easy to get a lot of tests and get the warm fuzzies, but if you aren't actually testing the meaningful, important parts, then what are you doing? I'm rewording what Gary said. But yeah, you want to test things that are meaningful. I usually try to look at an application as sort of 3 parts. So one part is the code your team wrote, right? So like that's your custom code. And then another part is the code your team didn't write. So that's like third-party like components, libraries, frameworks, includes all of that stuff. And then there's your application running and how it actually acts. So like dynamic testing. And so
that's a good way of putting it. I think for those that come from like a enterprise world, like I do, I think of it like those two, but then the third one, there's code we write, there's code we bought, and there's code we imported. Right. So the code we imported and the code we wrote is like, you know, we have control over that or some degree of control, like especially the one we wrote, we could control the imports. We could maybe update them. We could, I don't know, not use them. We could manage them to some degree. But then there's like the code you buy. And in large scale enterprises, like they're buying a lot of code. And so, you know, testing that is like a whole different kind of thing because when it's compiled already, it's DLLs, you know, it's things that you can't just like run static analysis on because it's like literally compiled code. But yeah, I like how you break those up into buckets because it puts some delineation around how to strategize, you know, the testing tooling.
Yeah, because I find that people will say, well, what tool should I buy? And I'm like, well, it's more like, where do you think you can get the most value? And then you decide the type of tool that you think will give you the most value. And then you pick a vendor. Or at least like that's the way I tend to do it. And it depends on the skill set you have at your office.
Yeah. You know, I guess I always think of it as like, what's open source? Like, what can I use open source first? And then like try to get a feel for how this works, right? like whether it's Dependabot, dependency checker, those are really good code we imported tooling to test, or at least just to check. I'm not sure I would say this is like, testing that code base. It's really checking that code base or checking that library or whatever you're importing to make sure that it's like healthy enough with no CVEs attached to it. But yeah, I try to take that open source approach first. And, Zap and Burp have dynamic testers built right into them, right? You use that one a lot, at least.
Yeah, I do.
Right. Yeah. So, and then even like a tool like SemGrep. I mean, I've been using that a lot lately. I mean, I don't want to get into like vendors and stuff. I think most of it, SemGrep is open source and you could just like freely use it, but it allows you to like write like queries against your code base to like detect bad practices in your code base. So if you want to make sure that all of your like SQL queries are using, parameterized queries, right? You can literally write a SemGrep query to check across your code base that is actually a truthful, you can say that truthfully, that all SQL queries are being properly structured.
Yeah, I think that I've heard the way that people talk about like, so SemGrep does static application security testing, but it's more, so like a traditional SAST tool is usually more like it takes your entire app, it parses down the code parts, and then it looks for areas that are indicative of a potential vulnerability. Well, SemGrep, it's more like it grabs, it's just like a fancy like searching feature and like pattern matches for anti-patterns. So it's like, hey, all input's supposed to have some sort of validation. Oh, here's some input. There's no validation. That breaks the pattern. So that sucks. So you should look at this. So
yeah.
Am I explaining that correctly?
No, totally. I mean, and for those that have used like large, like SaaS tools that perform the analysis the way you just described, where it sort of like creates like a bunch of different flows of the program and then like sort of goes through the entire code base. There could be a lot of false positives that result in that world, which can be like a little frustrating. I mean, I guess if you think about it like rationally, like you're a developer and you're kind of looking through a bug report from a SaaS tool and you're like, wait a second, there's like 30 false positives in here and like one real bug. Like you start to get, I mean, maybe those ratios, I don't want to like overstate. I don't know these ratios, but I think in my experience, there's been a lot of false positives that you have to kind of tread through and mark not an issue, NAI, that it could sort of make you as a developer, like lose faith in like these types of tools and say like, well, is it really that good? Is it really getting the things I want it to get? How do I tune this thing a little better? Like what can I do to make this like signal noise kind of get better, get more aligned?
Speaking of which, we have a question in the chat from Kellen. So verifying DAST results is sometimes challenging, especially if there's false negatives. Do we want to, how about I define DAST and then we could talk about like some strategies for verifying. So false negatives versus false positives, like that's a lot harder. But yeah, first of all, so DAST stands for Dynamic Application Security Testing Tool. And, OWASP, ZAP, Burp Suite, Nexploit, NetSparker, AppScan, it goes on and on and on. There's like a huge list, tons of companies make those. And what they do is they interact with your application as your application's running. And then they try to fuzzle your inputs. They try to figure out how they can attack things. They passively look at the requests and responses and try to figure out potential problems with your app. And so honestly, Nikki, when I started doing pen testing, I found the hardest part was validating my results. Like I'm like, hey, I ran Burp. I now have 54 things that it says might be wrong. And I have zero clue how to tell if that is true. And it took a long time to figure some of these out. Like, what are some strategies?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard, especially if you didn't write the application, you're the tester, right? You don't know that like specialness or variable name structure or, what is this post request actually doing? And, what is in that session cookie? Like there's all sorts of random data sitting in local storage, I mean, it can be really hard to parse through that. I guess I think that like, maybe there's a, how I guess you could try to start to validate this stuff. So if if Zap is saying to you like, all right, I had reflective XSS on, this post or this post request or this GET request, I got reflective XSS on the other side. I guess you could then like try to take that post request, GET request, and kind of validate that it is actually executing the JavaScript on the other side. You actually see the alert message or whatever it is. It's very laborious though. That could be a kind of laborious sort of thing. I mean, this is where people get into like secure by defaults, but I don't want to get into, we're talking about testing. We're not talking about that. So I don't know if I have the greatest answer aside from manual validation is kind of like that's what you do. That's the whole point of it. That's when you're an AppSec engineer, that's kind of what you're doing.
Yeah, like when it tells you, there's a potential blind SQL injection in this input, you kind of have to try to send some commands and see if it works. Like I use a sleep command. So I'll like try to send a sleep command to the database for like 5 seconds and see if it waits 5 seconds. And then I'll try like 45 seconds and I'll try 5 seconds and like see, is it waiting to come back? Or is it just like my server's slow and it sucks, right? Because I don't know if you've seen this, but like Burp will over and over again tell you, there's blind SQL. It's like, no, the server I'm testing just sucks, okay?
Well, I think there's also like more specific, what I will do, actually, I can answer your question. I thought through, like if you get a SQL injection or cross-site scripting alert from one of these dynamic scanners and you need to validate it, there are some pretty specific tools that can help you do this. SQL Map is one of them, right? SQL Map is a great tool. It's on GitHub. It's open source. It's written in Python, and it allows you to, like if you have a post, if there's a post request or a GET request, you have a bunch of variables somewhere that Burp is indicating or Zap is indicating might be vulnerable to SQL injection, you can kind of feed that data into SQL Map. And SQL Map, you can do a lot in there. You can tell it to like, dump specific tables or, do a bunch of different database queries. Like there's a tons of things you can do in there. But I try to drill in, I try to use those specific tools. There's another one called XSS Strike, cross-site scripting strike. It's the SQL Map-like tool for cross-site scripting validation. It's a little bit similar in functionality, but it's another great way of actually validating that this is a functional exploit and not a false positive. So that would be probably how I would do that. But I think it's a manual approach, which is, I think that's
expensive.
Yeah,
because you have to hire,
time consuming.
You have to hire an expert, and then you have to take a ton of that expert's time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking the next one, because there's lots of questions in the chat, briefly infrastructure testing. So this book's not about infrastructure. So I do cover it briefly because your app sits on infrastructure. And if your app is totally bulletproof and amazing, but your infrastructure looks like Swiss cheese with all the holes in it, you still have egg on your face if your application gets attacked successfully, right? So basically, yeah, Nikki?
I love this space, actually. I'm like super into this infrastructure as code pre-flight testing space. And like, I think if you think of it as like, okay, it's code, it's YAML, it's JSON, it's just declarative code, right?
If they're using infrastructure as code, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I guess you're right. If you're not using infrastructure as code, I don't know how to scan it in that other way, unless it's like scanning it once you're
You do
ready.
IAC and I'll do on-prem, I guess, originally.
Okay, yeah. Oh, you're talking about like regular vulnerability scanning?
Yeah. Like there are VA scanner tools. So like after your VM, your virtual machine or your container is created, and then you can scan it sort of afterwards for missing patches, bad configuration, poor life choices, as I like to call them. Seriously, Nikki, I have found some wacky things using VA scanners. But go back to infrastructure as code. Could we define infrastructure as code quickly?
Yeah, 100%. So I think infrastructure as code only exists because of the cloud, right? The cloud allows us to assert ourselves programmatically to it. So we can build servers, we can create blob storage or S3 buckets or whatever we need to do in GCP, all using a declarative kind of language, right? And so that exists now because of the cloud. I don't think it exists before. I guess there was a little bit, like Chef and Puppet were kind of like early stage infrastructure as code things, but it was to build VMs, a little different than building actual network infrastructure or server infrastructure in the cloud. And what it is, it's just basically a long file, and it allows you to, tell the cloud service, I want to build these things, and you configure it in this YAML file, and that's it. That's how it is. And you literally press a button, and it does the thing and builds the stuff in the cloud. And then like 6 minutes later, your infrastructure is done, and that's infrastructure as code. You are building infrastructure with code.
Yes. And so then you can do security as code.
Right. And so then, like your infrastructure, like let's just say you have some requirements. Your EBS volumes need to be encrypted. That's pretty common sense. We want our storage, persistent storage, to be encrypted at rest. Totally makes sense. That's like a flag in AWS. You just like check a box, right? If you're in the console. But in infrastructure as code, you literally have to say like encrypted volume, true, or EBS volume encrypted, true. Forget exactly the CloudFormation flag. But what you do there is you can define all the security steps in your infrastructure as code. And so then you could like write checks to make sure that you are building like all of my infrastructure is encrypted at rest, in transit. I don't have security groups that are open to 00000/0 on all ports. I don't have, things like real, like, my S3 buckets are all encrypted and they're not set to public access, or they're all behind ACLs or whatever security model you're kind of building in there. And so infrastructure as code allows you to like check that before it like goes into the cloud provider and potentially can cause some not great stuff.
Well, and then on top of infrastructure as code and security as code, like so setting the security requirements you want in the code, you can also scan infrastructure as code for policy. So like for Terraform, I think there's OPA, open policy. I forget what the A stands for.
Agent.
Yeah, and basically like you set policy. So like let's say like Nikki's example. So you want to have long-term storage encrypted. And so you scan all the infrastructure as code with this policy. So if you have a new dev who thought that they could write some infrastructure as code and forgot to put the encryption thing, it'll say, oh, that broke policy. No, thank you. And so then it never gets out into production in the first place. It's so exciting. I'm such a nerd for infrastructure as code.
And I'll just like dive in a little further on OPA. You could also use this stuff to check your Kubernetes configs before they go into your Kubernetes cluster. So it's like one layer up, because it's not like infrastructure. It is infrastructure, but it's like infrastructure in Kubernetes, which is like container infrastructure. Yeah. But you can use OPA to make sure that that container infrastructure is like well configured, right? Like I'm not pulling images from random internet sources. I'm not, kind of doing things that I don't want, or everything's tagged and labeled properly, or whatever it is you're looking to do.
Yes. So we have another question from Andrea. So I also rarely see projects doing security-related unit testing and integration testing. Instead, they try to buy a tool or have a pen test once a year. So I would be interested how you approach to writing automated security unit and integration tests. And then Gary says, I utterly agree. Gary, you're the best. So I talk to a lot of companies who thinks an annual pen test is the answer to security, and it drives me kind of nuts. And I have to say, like, so for security unit tests, like talk to the devs. And if they have unit tests, then you literally can create a copy in the code and then add like underscore abuse case or underscore sec or whatever you want, and then add crappy payloads. That is my strategy. Like I've heard of people doing like security user stories and like going through, but it rarely happens out in the wild because it's labor intensive, right? But if you can convince the devs to let you make a unit test that goes along, or if you have a security champions program where you have strong security champions who know how to write unit tests, who are willing to do that work, but unit tests are labor intensive, but then you get regressive security testing with every check-in, and it's kind of amazing. What do you think, Nikki?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one because you're sort of overlapping in the QA world here, right? Like there are companies that have standards around unit integration testing and they metric that stuff. Like how much code coverage? Is it like 40%, like 60? Is it good? Is it bad? But I guess I view this as like the diet and exercise problem. This is like the proverbial InfoSec problem, right? Which is, yes, diets work. Yes, exercise works. This is how we stay healthy. But we need to prioritize it. We need to carve out the time to do it. And it's very easy to be like, tomorrow I'll start the diet, and tomorrow I'll do that run, and you just keep pushing it and pushing it, right?
Mhm.
And I think certain practices in InfoSec kind of really nicely align with that psychology. We can easily punt them, right? It doesn't hurt us in the short term, right? In the long term, it might hurt us, but and so I think unit integration tests kind of fit in that model, right? Like you should
Mhm.
sort of get into the habit of like maybe having these things because they are helpful, especially
Mhm.
when you want like a QA assurance model to be like strong. I don't know. That's my experience. I don't know. Maybe like they're not really useful, but in my experience, the QA teams seem to really enjoy knowing that they're there.
Yeah, I feel like we don't always talk to the QA team as much as we should as security professionals. Like I personally feel that anyone that is willing to like do security work is my friend. And so I want to meet the QA team and I want to teach them how to use scanners, or for instance, like let's say, I've worked with some companies where their QA team has these amazing automated Selenium tests, and they like have a full suite of testing every single functional requirement. And I'm like, hey, can I have those HAR files that you've recorded? And then I like feed them into my DAST scanner. And then I have like a short, quick DAST scan where it just fuzzes those parts. And then I get better results. But if the QA team is not doing stuff like that, then I don't want to waste anyone's time by asking for that. And I don't want to try to give them a ton of work that they're not agreeing to. I want to try to figure out what they're doing and see what could complement what I need. And sometimes showing up with like donuts helps. But anyway.
Donuts.
Well, like I'm not a donut person, but it turns out like a lot of the world is. So there are some more questions, and I kind of wanted, so like I feel like Andrea's question, so he talked about unit tests, but he also talked about integration testing. And I would say that integration testing kind of leads us into part of the deployment part of this chapter, which is, in my opinion, so I've seen manual integration testing and the pain it causes. And I'm a big fan of using a CICD pipeline whenever possible, sometimes called a DevOps pipeline, sometimes called release pipeline or just CICD, but like automated software that handles your deployment, and you can put tests in and it automatically does a bunch of tests. If everything passes and looks good, it puts your code or your app or your infrastructure out into an environment, and then it goes from there. And so like, let's say I'm a dev and I pass all my unit tests, and so I push my code in, and then it passes whatever tests are there, and then it takes it and it's like, I'm going to build Tanya's app. It passes. It's not awful. I'm going to copy it to that dev server she asked me to copy it to. Now it's on the dev server. I'm going to punch it in the face with a DAST tool. It passes that. Yay, we still like her. Now it's going to go on to some QA tests. And it keeps doing that until theoretically, if I'm lucky, it makes it all the way to prod. And so you can test integration with these systems. And so like, let's say, I'm writing code and Nikki's writing code. I don't want my code to break her code. That's not cool. And like, let's say she's writing, a service, like a web service that I want to call. And so maybe her API gets compiled and everything first and built, and it gets put out onto the little web server. And then mine gets compiled and it gets put out. And then it's on the same web server. I'm like, great. Then we write a test where it needs to call those things. Or somehow, like one, we want to test her web service or API on its own to make sure it stands on its own. But we also want to make sure we test my app calling it and that is working well. And so I try to automate these things because manual things pain me.
Yeah, no, that was a good description of integration testing. And yeah.
Sorry, I went on and on.
No, it was good. I think sometimes people get a little, I sometimes like, is that a unit test or an integration test? It does get a little complicated to explain that, but yeah. Yes, automating that. And then you can kind of get into the whole CI world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And CD world. But I think we're saving that for later. I don't know if I don't want to get too ahead of our skis here.
No, we could totally do it. It's our show, Nikki. We have the right. Gary was just saying K8s or Kubernetes security is a great point. He saw an attack vector recently where someone could compromise a container that has too many permissions. Download the, how do you pronounce that? Cubicle?
Kubectl. I mean, that's how I do it. I think there's probably like a whole internet debate that could happen with this.
So they download the Kubectl tool, and then they own everything. Yeah, that's terrifying, Gary.
Well, they probably got the keys there, so they were able to, that's a pretty good container compromise. So
yeah, it's terrifying. But Mo Trotter's saying deployment talk, pretty please. So it feels like we're not really too ahead.
All right. So then maybe we should just define some terminology. CI, CD, like these are buzzwords. I guess they're buzzwords. You hear them a lot. Continuous integration and continuous deployment, right? And so continuous integration, I think you just kind of described that, right? Like
the idea of using an automated, the idea of making sure that we are doing trunk-based development. So I don't know, Nikki, have you ever had a dev go off for like 6 weeks by themselves and they're real quiet and they're not checking anything in? And then they've made this crazy feature that breaks everything in the main branch. And you're like, dude,
Yeah, I have not experienced that, but hopefully that's not the team culture, right? You probably want to have more, check-ins around your code base and making sure it's kind of playing nice with others.
Yeah. So I guess the idea of continuous integration is the idea that you are continuously putting things together, but then there's, continuous, so I like to think of it as CD as standing for continuous deployment, but also, sorry, I'm like looking through my book and I'm kind of like all over the place because I don't have my physical book with me today because I'm working from someone else's home because sometimes that's what happens in COVID and I don't know what else to tell you. But so like continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So like continuous delivery, I would say is like doing continuous integration, but using a tool, like using pipeline software, using something to automate that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then continuous deployment being, you think your tests are so awesome sauce, you have a lot of faith, you're totally confident, you don't need a person or a bunch of persons to push the button. It can just go out to prod.
Yeah. And it flows like automatic off the assembly line, just drives itself to the gas station, right? Like you just trust it. It doesn't need anything else. You believe in the process, just keeps going. But yeah, and continuous deployment can go in a lot of directions. It could. I'm
showing a picture.
Oh, cool. Yeah. It could kick off some IAC scripts, right? It could do some infrastructure. Maybe it needs to build something before it deploys itself, or it needs some extra stuff. Who knows how the deployment model works? It could maybe dump a new container into a Kubernetes cluster, and it could just rolling update that and just be live in 6 to 9 minutes. There's a lot of different ways that you could orchestrate like a continuous deployment process, really dependent on the application itself. You could just drop a zip file into a Java directory and just now that thing's ready to go. It's up and live, Yeah, JBoss found it. Cool. Yeah, so it really depends, but that's essentially what you're describing is that you fully trust the processes that precede that, and you're like completely committed to like pushing the button automatically.
I have worked at places where they do some of the most labor and administrative intense deployment processes where you have to have a technical advisory group meeting and they'll argue about whether or not you're allowed to do this change. And then you have a CAB meeting, change advisory board, and then all the managers argue based on what their technical staff told them. And they know way less, but somehow they decide. And then you like follow Runbooks. So I told Nikki that I have a hate on for Runbooks. I've only worked at one place where I had to do the stupid task of creating Runbooks. So you write out, you take screenshots, and you make the world's longest Microsoft Word document. It's like longer than my book. And then you tell them every single thing that the ops team needs to do. And then they look at it. They do not follow it because it's stupid and it's so long and I've definitely missed something. And then they're sitting there trying to follow like this archaic thing with screenshots and etc. And then guess what happens? At some point, the ops person calls me. I'm like, oh yeah, press this button. Oh yeah, there. Can I come over? Blah, blah. And then we just deploy it together. Or they muddle through it and maybe it works. And you spend hours and hours and hours and hours creating a stupid ass run book no one reads, in my experience.
Well, I mean, I think you're right there, right? If we're talking a lot about automation and moving fast, continuous integration, continuous deployment, having a run book where you have to read with eyeballs does add friction to this whole process, right? Like you probably, should move away from that. However, I'm going to defend Runbooks just for a second. I'm not saying they're amazing, but I'll defend them. If something goes south, right? Mm-hmm. And the app's not working, or there's some P1, P2, P3 against it, and you're like, ugh, what is going on with this app? Like, I don't even know. I'm just an SRE, new. Mm-hmm. It could be valuable in that context.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I don't mean that we shouldn't do any documentation.
No, I know.
I just find, I don't know, I've just found it painful and slow. I think actually I worked at a few places that did run books, but there was just one where it was awful. I remember them making me make the run books after because it was a business requirement to have run books, but we'd already deployed. And I was just like, I hate my life.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a bureaucratic component there that I totally resonates with me, right? Like, compliance says you need a run book. Okay, I'm going to make a run book, right? And no one's going to ever read it. And then every year you're going to get hassled to update the run book and no one ever reads it and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, exactly. Totally. I totally agree. There's probably a better way to do more real-time documentation, or that's not a real word, but more, I don't know. There's probably a better way to improve operational documentation more broadly. But
have you ever worked somewhere where you find out someone's editing documents live on the prod server?
It sounds like I could have worked somewhere that could have happened, but I just didn't actually observe it.
I was working somewhere, and I'm not going to say which year because it'll be really obvious from my resume where it was, where there was a guy that was in charge of all of our classic ASP apps, and he was away on vacation for a month. And so then I got this bug in, and so I get the code out of our code repository and and I'm just like, wow, this app is so different than what I'm seeing in production. And I kept looking at it. And so then I yanked the code off prod and did a diff. They're completely different. And I noticed, oh, he hasn't checked code in 2.5, 3 years. And he'd just been editing live on the prod server for years. Yeah. And then I explain, and I tell the story in the book of me being the senior engineer saying, everything must be checked into source control. Everything must be versioned. Everything, you must test in dev first. And I got the guy's well, it's a waste of time. And you don't work on the classic ASP apps. So maybe you should mind your own business. And then I yelled at him, and I don't yell very often. I'm like, it's called industry best practices for a reason. I just exploded. And my boss was like, you can't just yell stuff at other employees. I'm like, and he made me make a presentation and prove to the whole team why they needed to use source control, because it turned out a bunch of them weren't.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a lot of broken processes to me. I mean, and I think there's a security yelling and screaming component that we all have to endure. But there's also this is just service development and service delivery. Yeah, this is just dev hygiene stuff, right? This is not, the security team might have a strong opinion about this, but this is internal dev teams that need to develop better processes, because that's cowboy style, and bad things are going to happen when I edit my code in prod and I hit save and I'm like, cool, man, let's just,
hope for the best with multiple.
I guess I could, they probably have a bunch of files index 1 old _ old 1 _ 4 back, so they could just
It was a very painful discovery that day, Nikki, and I realized why I was the senior tech.
I get it.
Explaining, having to convince a third of the team that we had to use source control and that it was not a waste of time, and all the problems are, I was just like, do I still want to work here?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, hopefully, people learn their lesson around why, I mean, the other good thing about having all your source control in one place is like, with tools like SumGrep, not to keep going back. I mean, there's, GitHub as CodeQL. There's a bunch of these kind of emerging tools out there now. You can actually like parse your whole code base because it's all sitting in one place, and like find things that like, let's just say you're using React or, some JavaScript framework. You have a package.json file that has all your dependencies, right? And every app has all this. So there's like 14 package.json files you can like look through to like check your supply chain and like make sure that like the 4,000 React dependencies are actually okay. You can't do that if you don't have organization. I mean, this is like foundational stuff. Like you can't build a house on like, a swamp here. You have to kind of lay down some good concrete here to sort of get like strong pillars going. So it's no different there than, Yeah,
honestly, like when I talk to some companies like and help them with their AppSec programs, sometimes they're like, well, all the devs follow a different, like they all use a different tech stack. They all put their code in different repos. Like maybe 20% are using pipeline software and like they're all using different ones. And like none of them really talk to us and we don't know what their system development lifecycle looks like. How can we secure all the apps? And I'm like, well, I think that we need to set like a good foundation of something, like at least put, like at the very least, if you could get them all to put their code in the same repo, then you can scan it all for secrets. You can do software composition analysis. You can do like a SEM-greppy, like searching for anti-patterns. And then you could do static application security testing. Like you can do all of that if the code's in the same place. But if they're all using different pipelines and they're all using, I'm just like, so you have zero control over anyone. And you're like, how can we get the ultimate control over everyone? And I'm like, you need to start at the beginning. That's the answer.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And for those that are faced with similar challenges, as Tanya's describing, I'm a big fan of maturity models here, right? So like, obviously you're not going to wave a wand and everyone's just going to be in source code tomorrow. There's going to have to be some maturing and some flexibility around how we get there and some road mapping and some, let's set some objectives. Like we get 3 apps into a code base by June and 6 by August and 9 by October. You kind of come up with this way of making this work. I mean, that's so common sense, but like sometimes, at least in my experience with security in that environment, you get overwhelmed, and normal security people will get overwhelmed because it's like, I have no idea what's going on. I have no visibility into anything. This guy is calling or it's not, I don't know, And so, to me, breaking this down into like incremental steps of maturing an organization is actually makes me feel sane and gives me something to kind of march towards on a Monday morning. Like this week, we're going to do that.
Yes.
And we're going to feel good about it.
Yes. I often talk to clients. I'm like, listen, if all of your devs are going to use different CICDs and different tech stacks, if you can just get their code all into like, let's say, so like I'm a GitHub fan. I used to work at Microsoft. I'm allowed to still love their products and I'm allowed to fangirl all I want. So if you put code there, like into GitHub, you can use GitHub Actions. Like Gary was saying, you get like 2,000 free minutes per month, right? So every time a dev checks in some code, the security team can easily run like a pre-commit hook. So as they're checking it in, look for secrets. And if it looks like a secret, say, no, thank you. And then after it's in, like run a bunch of other scans, and then you can use a GitHub action to also make a ticket for you in Jira or put an issue in GitHub for you. And like you can do all of these things for the devs while they're still using Jenkins to release their code, right? Like there's a lot of possibilities, but if your code is literally scattered amongst the planet, it's just like, well, what are you doing? That's literally your most important thing is your code, your intellectual property.
Yeah, and you could actually run a full-blown CI/CD through GitHub Actions alone. Yeah. It's pretty powerful, and it's like honestly clicking buttons on a web interface. It's not hard to set this up at all. It's very easy, and GitHub has worked really hard to make this like easier and easier. So yeah, GitHub is now owned by Microsoft. Then yes, I believe that is still true. Yes.
Yeah, and you know what else you can do, Nikki? So maybe this is because I have thousands of followers on Twitter, but it could be anything, is that if there's a security tool that you like and that you use and there's no GitHub action for it, I've just written them and said, I really like your tool and one of my clients and I want to use it with GitHub Actions. Could you write a GitHub action for me? And a whole bunch of them did. And like now, if you look, there's like over 300 different security tool GitHub Actions. And some of them are created by community members. Thank you to all the people that do that. Like Hugo, who wrote one for me for Dependency Checker. You're awesome, buddy, if you see this. But then lots of them are just written by the company.
That is, I did not know that. I guess you could, you're right. You can crowdsource this up. And
yeah, you can write your own GitHub Actions if you want to, but like I'm lazy and I want it to be official from the company if I can.
Yeah. So I guess next time I need one, I'm just going to ask you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but for real though, like what I do is I just write them and I explain like GitHub Actions is the way. Like there's, hundreds of millions of developers choose GitHub. Like, why would you not want to have a thing that makes it easy for people to use your awesome tool there? And I just like make them kind of like a business case for it. And then they're like, okay, yeah. Like Sneak, for instance, they, so a community member had created one. And his name's Brian Clark, and he's someone I used to work with at Microsoft. And I was like, Brian, it's like kind of doing this and it's a bit wonky. Can you help me? And we were like tweeting back and forth about it. And then someone from Sneak noticed and they're like, oh, do you want us to just make you one? And I was like, oh, that would be really nice. Thank you. And then they made one. And so then Brian didn't have to fix his and deal with me hassling him. And then I could just use like the official one from the official company, which is sort of ideal, right? Because then it has support and all those things. But yeah, they're like, that actually wasn't that hard.
Yeah. And I guess the community really benefits, right? Like this is not just one person using like a special tech stack or some special integration. Like maybe it's some big vendor that just doesn't have this integrated because for reasons and like, integrations are a hard problem in cybersecurity. And like there's a lot of tools out there and it is not easy to integrate all of these tools. And there's reasons and reasons and reasons why they don't all play nice with each other. But yeah, I'm a big fan of that. So
I also
more integration.
Well, and so let's say you managed to get all of your devs to put all their code in GitHub. And then let's say your company can afford to buy like 2 tools, right? And that's cool. Like you don't need 27 tools. And so then you write, like you, the security team, like work out the bugs on one of the projects with that dev team, then you just share the YAML with the rest of the team. It's just like, yeah, this needs to go in the jobs section and you just copy it like this. And if there's red squiggly lines, you just need to keep putting spaces because YAML hates us. It hates spacing. And then like once the red squiggly lines are done, you're fine. Call us if you need help, right? And then like you have this beautiful kind of like, here's a proof of concept, here's how it works, here's how this looks, and here's the code, just give her. And like, I like the idea of being able to like reproduce the same results with lots of different teams and then fix problems. So Nikki.
Yeah, anytime you could get leverage and scale is a win in security. So 100%.
Yeah.
Chasing bugs is going to kill people.
Oh my gosh.
Or it already did, probably. I don't know.
Yeah. So we have questions at the end of this chapter that we're supposed to answer. Do you think it's time for questions? Because we have managed to answer all of the audience's like really awesome questions, I think.
Yeah, let's do it. Exercises.
I was thinking I'll put the question across and then you and I can answer it, but some of them the audience has to answer. So audience, get ready because there's some where you have to answer. Like we're not going to answer. We want you to answer. So the first one is, when should you use your own identity on the network, a user account versus a service account? Give 2 examples and explain why. Is that from this? Just a second.
I think
I'm doing the wrong one. Yeah, this is the wrong one. Just a second. Ignore this one. Hide. I'm doing the wrong one. Where? So these are the wrong ones, but that's okay and it's totally fine. How do I like make the ticker not tick? There we go. Okay, so if you could choose one type of testing to perform on your application and only one, what type would it be and why? Oh, thank you. Oh, I see what I did now. I see what I did. Thank you.
This
is hard.
Yeah, this is hard. One only. I guess I would just go for like a smash and grab dynamic DAS test.
Me too.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, just looking for the lowest hanging fruit and the most obvious bugs that might be missed somewhere. And
I feel like if you can only do one type of automated test, that doing that, like doing a DAS scan, because so like if some malicious actor is off on the internet, they don't have a copy of your code. They can't do SAST or SCA on you. But what they can do is they can zap you with Zap for free, right? And then they find this low-hanging fruit. I want to fix all that low-hanging fruit. If I've only got one shot, like fix the obvious stuff.
Like an old directory sitting in robots.txt that is easily knowable and that has like some config file in it with a password, right? Stuff like that. Yeah.
Andreas is saying, what about explorative security testing? What is explorative security testing? What would that be?
I think it's when you just sort of like chaos monkey everything.
Oh.
Do I have that right? Maybe we should ask him to confirm that that's right. I'm not sure that that's right.
Please confirm, Andreas, because like, yeah, I'm not sure.
Sort of like ad hoc testing things randomly, making sure that there's like, I think there's some randomness in that.
I could
Google it.
Okay. I would rather find like the things that are super obvious that a 14-year-old who's really angry about life that lives in their parents' basement and wears a black hoodie and sits in the dark and hacks. I want to be able to make sure that person can't get in. Yeah. Audience, yes, just like a free-form testing. Okay, Andreas. Yeah, so do I think that has value? Yes, but would I choose it first? Not me. Nikki?
I guess if there was a tool that was like super great and like could like really give you good reliability around that and like we tested it and trusted it, yeah. But it sounds to me like it's human driven. I mean, I guess that is a test you could do. You could do a manual pen test on everything that goes out the door. That is another option, but it's just the most expensive option.
Yeah, that's just it. Is the most expensive option? Okay, let's try question number 2.
Okay.
Which type of testing do you think would be the fastest and why? Well, I have my thoughts. I would say, do you want to go first? You go first.
Probably SCA.
That's exactly
right?
what I was gonna say.
Just check the versions, check a database of CVEs, and yeah.
Like if it's a .NET app, like a C# app, it just looks at the CS proj file and like it's like, here's the 12 NuGet packages that Tanya made bad decisions about. And then it just like looks at the new, and then it's like, oh yeah, she did make bad decisions here. Let's tell her. Yeah, I think it's the fastest. I would say maybe secret scanning, maybe next. Because it's just
truffle hog. Yeah, or just like looking for the word password and stored credentials, keys, PEM. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's a good one. And that's a good like high risk, or that's a good high leverage find.
Yeah. So in regard to free-form testing, Kellen says, just give the app to your children. And then Ben says, Netflix has a type of program that does that. And I believe what you are talking about is specifically Chaos Monkey, and it tests infrastructure. And it does chaos, like chaos engineering.
Right, and just like taking stuff down and see how things respond and what craps out and crashes. Robustness, right? That's what you're looking for, right? Like ability to recover, resiliency. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, I
just give your app to children. Did you see that one?
Yeah, I did see that one. Just give your app to children. It's like, no. I have stepkids, and oh my gosh, yeah. They are amazing. Especially one of them in particular would probably turn it inside out in like 4 minutes. Pen tester in the making.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Nikki, which type of testing do you think is the slowest and why?
I guess I would say a large dynamic analysis on a really, really, really large app that has like, I don't know, I've seen apps with like, 1,000 ASPX pages, right? And it's like, whoa, what are all these pages doing? All right, maybe I think it was a lot. I mean, I was scrolling and scrolling through that directory. There was a lot going on in there. Yeah, that would probably take a while, but static analysis would probably take a while there too. So I kind of feel like it's a toss up there. Both of those require a lot of work. So with SCA, we were just pattern matching versions and kind of moving along. With the other two, we actually have to
analyze,
do a thing and analyze. But then again, wouldn't the code review kind of line up there too and take?
Yeah. What about a manual pen test? Because like if someone's doing, because I remember asking my pen test mentor, like, how do I know when I've done enough? He's like, when your contract runs out of time.
Well, that's what I've always found a little strange. You know, I was a pen tester for years, and sometimes you find a few good bugs and you're like, you know, there's going to be a pretty good report. And then you have to keep going and keep testing. But, you know, sometimes it's a little front heavy, right? The things you found at first, like, you know, that like these things need to be, and they're probably reflective, like a lot of similar risks in the application. Like if you found, you know, like 10 or 15 cross-site scriptings because of the same underlying issue, you probably know there's like 10,000 of them, right? And it's like, at this point, it's time to like fix the code base, right? So sometimes pen testing, you're right. Like just as your pen test mentor described, you run out of hours, you're running out of bugs. You're not looking for more bugs. Like time's up.
Yeah. Write your report and get moving is what I was told to do. But when they ask like, how long do you need to test? I'm like, how many days are you allowed giving me? Like 10, 14? Like how many can I have? And yeah, I guess it depends on what level of test they want too. Like, do I get to, like, is this going to be clear box testing where I get to see the code as well? And I can like come in and meet the team and ask them questions like, how far am I allowed to go on this? And they're like, that's not pen testing. I'm like, it's giving you value. I was not good at pen testing. I was always better at AppSec. And that's okay. Okay, I have more questions, Nikki. What types of vulnerabilities would you want to look for in regression testing? It says name two and choose why.
Ooh,
you know, I'm allowed answering them too if you want. You don't have to actually answer all of them. It's not like Quiz the Nikki, the show.
No, I'm trying to think like what would be a good thing to look for during a regression test. I guess
anything
new changes.
New changes. Yeah, definitely testing those parts. But I mean like stuff that already happened. Like we found XSS here. Like test again to make sure that it didn't come back. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Or I guess you divide it up. At least my understanding is like, you're like, all right, this is the old stuff. This is the new stuff. Like what's changed? Is the old stuff still vulnerable in the new stuff? That's a problem. Somebody's not reading bug reports. What do we do? Yeah. So like that could be cross-site scripting. That could be missing security headers. That could be injection vulnerabilities or like all sorts of things. To break off slightly, Gary's saying it's worth discussing the frequency of the types of testing if the time to run can be such a variable. Oh yeah.
That's a good point. If time is your big limiting factor here, then yeah, I guess you have a different, it's a good conversation to have. Like,
oh, if it's going to take like 18 hours to run a SAST scan, you're not running that every week. It's just not happening.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen situations where deployments can take 14 hours to actually do the deploy, right? So then you're dealing with a different time problem, which is I can't add more time to this deployment because it's already like a whole weekend to deploy this thing. So then security becomes like, time, you're right. That is a good point, Andreas.
You know, I worked somewhere, and I kid you not, Nikki, it was 2 weeks to roll out their app. 2 weeks.
I thought the 14 hours was bad.
It was, well, and like they didn't have SQL scripts. Their database administrator was like, oh, I just know what I'm doing. So I just like write it myself. And so then guess what? It failed all the time. And I was like, no, all of this needs to be automated. You have one script, you run it on dev. And if it doesn't work, you don't make manual changes. You rewrite your script over and over until it deploys correctly. And then you can do it from level to level. You're like, oh, you know what I want to do? I want to make this mistake 12 times. Because they had 13 environments. because they had something like 112 integrations. It was like super, super complex system. But I was just like, why would you allow him to do that manually? And they're
Is
like,
that thing still going?
Yeah.
You think that thing's still on the internet?
No comment.
Poor guy, poor sysadmins on that one.
I know. Oh yeah, it was a hard system, and they're like, Tanya's being mean. She's being mean to Mike. I'm like, I'm not being mean to Mike. I'm telling you that you write scripts. You don't. Anyway, so So just a second. I just want to make sure. Okay, this is the correct question. So like, we have another question.
Yeah.
Does your workplace have a zero trust network? If you don't know the answer, your homework is to find out. And so this isn't a question for you. This is a question for the audience. So I'm hoping that the audience will answer this. Does your workplace have a zero trust network design? And we can discuss zero trust, Nikki. But people on this call, if you don't know, you should find out, because that is an interesting thing to know. And we talk about it a bit. You're both being nice to the people that have to deal with those problems later. Yeah.
Well, I've been those people, so I my heart just goes out to those people. So.
Yeah, hug ops.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Zero trust.
Zero trust. So, I mean, like, we could say that SheHacksPurple is a zero trust design network, but we don't have a network. Yeah. We just don't actually have a network. So yeah.
Well, I guess you're moving away from moats and castles, right? This isn't Game of Thrones. We're not trying to fortify the fort here and protect ourselves in this one place, central place. And so now our things are everywhere, right? We have SaaS services, we have Salesforce, we have G Suite, we have, I don't know, like it's a SaaS potpourri, right? And
so true.
We want to make sure that the people that are accessing either these SaaS services or these document management systems or storage services are the people they say they are, and that they are allowed to access said thing, and that their identity is checked frequently to ensure that they are coming from a device that is understood and a network that, or an IP or some sort of network segment that is within relative behavioral, some sort of, you didn't just log in from, a US IP address and then 10 seconds later you logged in from a Canadian IP address. It's impossible travel alert. Maybe that's a problem. Or you're just using a VPN. Either way, it's probably a good flag, right?
Yeah. Or you're not using the company's VPN.
Right. Yeah. So that's sort of what zero trust is purporting to be, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you're just checking security at kind of a different layer. Maybe
I feel like the idea is there's no more implied trust, right? Like we used to, you would be on the network at work and then everything's fine. Everything trusts everything. Or, you have some zones like we're going to have a firewall around the databases. Great. But if you get onto one database, you can talk to all of them, because they're all friends. They just trust each other. And now that's changing, where we're not trusting every database to talk to every other database anymore. It's like, you know what? App XYZ, its database only needs to talk to it, and that's it. Or maybe there's some web services that are allowed to talk to that database, and then that's it. And then the DBA can go through the portal or whatever, but everything else is just blocked by default. Like we only open it if it must be open, versus like just having things open by default. I have more questions, Nikki.
Yeah, keep going. I'm loving them. I mean, do we have any audience questions? Are we still making sense to people, you think?
Yeah. So Andreas is saying, so having TLS, auth, and auth everywhere, and network segmentation. Yeah, I would say like not even necessarily network segmentation, like everything is just closed, like not having a segment where, or maybe he means like firewalls around each thing. But
yeah, I mean, I think you're just checking auth-n and auth-z more frequently, right? In the moats and castles approach, you kind of check it once when someone VPNs in. And then maybe it's like, I don't know, you're good, man. You're in there. You got an IP address. You're just in the network. Everything on the inside is the inside. And maybe zero trust is purporting to be something a little different, right? Like we check that stuff more and more because there is no central thing. Therefore, wherever you go, we're going to evaluate that and that and that all over again at that identity layer, at that like sort of layer 7 layer. It's really just using a lot of application proxies to check your identity and make sure that, I guess, what you're trying to do is still like allowable kind of network activity. So I think it's very similar. Like I try to like maybe walk back the idea that it's so radically different than what we've been doing, because I don't know if I believe it is that radically different. I think it's just, we're just checking at a different layer and we're checking more and we're not relying on that like egg approach, right? Where like, what is it? The egg on the outside's hard, but then on the inside, it's like, right?
Yes, exactly. Like once you get into the network, it's not that everything is just open. Like you still have to essentially like not prove yourself, but like prove that you are who you are. And then, they re-verify via an access list or whatever that you are allowed this access or your role. Oh, there's a question from Gary. I'm going to just put it on the screen. So, thoughts on how to protect production? Do we lock it down so hard, literally, no one can log in? So fixes have to be new deploys down the CICD pipeline. Debugging must be through the monitoring logging. Yes.
Okay, this is a good question. Yeah, you want to take a stab at it, Tanya, or you want me? I'm fine either way.
I have some. So I feel like thoughts on how to protect production are slightly different than like if all new fixes have to go down the CICD. So if we're talking about infrastructure as code and immutable infrastructure, that means, so people talk about like pets versus livestock, and I don't really like that analogy, but the idea of, are we going to just like replace the container or the virtual machine or whatever with one that we have tested that we know is good? Or are we going to continue to patch and like feed it and take care of it like a pet and keep it for a long time? Versus immutable infrastructure, you just replace it. And so all changes to infrastructure that would go out to production are, unless it is a true emergency during some sort of, like there's an incident and someone runs out and does the thing, but then they still go through and patch it through all the things to make sure, because quite often during security incidents or regular like operational incidents, someone goes to make a fix and they're trying really hard and they're doing their best, but they break a bunch of crap when they do it. And so that's why we run it through all the tests and rigmarole that we usually do. And so I feel like thoughts on how to protect production is like a separate question in my eyes. I don't know. What do you think, Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been in these debates a lot where it's like, can never touch the console. No one can go into the console. Everything has to be like, infrastructure as code. And I think that's like a worthy goal, right? It does feel like you want to restrict access to the console because, again, preventative, you can't check console modifications until after they're done, right? I mean, if somebody's in as an admin, they can kind of do whatever they want. And then after the fact, you're like, oh, the S3 buckets are all public. Whoops. Whereas if it's infrastructure as code, you can put in policies in place to kind of prevent that from actually happening. Yes. So I think it's a worthy goal to try to restrict access to the console. I think sometimes, when the proverbial sort of crap hits the fan, you do need to get access into that console. You do need certain things. You might need to move faster and you might need access to that console. So I think it's like, if you can mature the organization into a place where limited access to the console is the goal, and you guys can all get there using really strong IAC checks and things like that, that's great. You sound like you're in a great place. But I think for the rest of us, there's going to have to be some limited access to the console to kind of, you're still going to need access to the console one way or another. You're going to bury your root keys in a bank vault somewhere or something, but you might need them one day. So
yes. I'd like to just agree a lot with Nikki. So the next question was, so this is for the audience, not so much for Nikki or I. Does your workplace allow the use of a CI/CD pipeline for custom software? If you do not know the answer, dear listeners and viewers, it is your job to find this out. Yes, that's right. Tanya is assigning you homework right now. Even if you didn't buy the book, I'm assigning you homework. So in the chat, does your workplace use a CICD? And sometimes it's about getting permission to do it, because I have worked at places where they're like, no, you're not allowed doing that. And then I've worked at places where they're like, why aren't you doing that yet? So we'll wait to see if some answers come in on that. Do you use CICD? I guess like you're way at the top now doing CISO stuff. So you're like, I am not at the coding level anymore.
Well, I think you could use CICD for all sorts of custom code. I mean, I don't see any issue with that at all. I think it's totally, why would you not? Am I missing the question?
It's like if someone is like in an old waterfall shop, they're not allowed using it.
Well, then I think there's a lot of homework that has to be done. Again, talk about building out better processes, right? Like this is a structural improvement that needs to be made across a variety of stakeholders. So if that's a limiting factor in a DevOps or SRE team, and they can't use a CICD process or tool, then it's probably a good time to sit down with leadership and say, hey, are we going to live like it's 1996 here? Or are we going to try to, kind of get with something a little bit more modern that meets more, and again, try to find a business reason to do this. Like if my production deployment takes 2 weeks, like at some point, somebody's going to have to get pissed off about that, right? Isn't that like too long to wait? Like, there's got to be some pain somewhere that you can surface up and be like, we could outlive like this. We need to be able to release faster. In order to release faster, we need automation. In order to have automation, we have to, unwind the hairball here.
Yes, I agree so much, Nikki. But it is everyone's homework to find out if they use CICD where they live.
It is.
So the next question is, if you are, so like this is theoretical. So if you work somewhere and there's a CI/CD pipeline, should you implement a static application security testing tool and then run a complete scan of the entire code every single time there's a new build? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Did I write this question really, really biased? Or because I know my answer. And
I mean, yeah. What does it cost you to run it every single time?
Oh yeah, hours and hours and hours and hours. I mean, if that's true, then maybe you might want to think like, all right, maybe I should do an incremental scan or just a what's changed scan. I feel confident in the other previous scans. And I think that's dependent on, how quickly you want this release to happen and sort of internal processes around. Some people just have like, policies that state code can't go to production unless it's scanned, right? And so interpreting that and finding meaningful, you want to, at the end of the day, we're looking to find bugs here. We're not looking to like add unnecessary complications to a process. So I think, if you could run a complete scan and your code base is small. Yeah. If you could, I would say that generally, like if you have a large code base, like just the changes, like just the delta, just the new code. And then maybe once every 10 scans, run the full scan.
Or a big release, like a big release where like a lot of different things are changing. Maybe some critical functions are changing. And at that point, it might make sense to kind of check it again. Yeah.
Exactly.
But if it's just a bug fix release, then, I don't think you need, I think just what's changed.
Yeah, and it's going to produce false positives, right? And we don't want to break the build by accident.
And sometimes I've seen this happen too, and this is a very discouraging place to be. DAST tool will not find a bug and then find a bug during a next round of testing that has been there for like the last 5 years. And you're kind of like, and the developers are like, well, thanks DAST tool, but this has kind of been there for a while.
And that's a weird one when that happens.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another question. Why is it critical to put all new changes into a code repository as opposed to saving it locally or just on the server. Does anyone in the audience want to answer this? Because I'm hoping that, oh, so Gary is saying for the last question, we don't run the SAST on deploys to feature branches, but we do it on merges to the dev main branch. Yeah, I like that, Gary. And a lot of people are saying yes. Oh, and Ben, SAST is static application security testing. So that means it tests the code your team wrote and tries to find vulnerabilities in it. So audience, why is it critical to put all new changes into a code repository? I mean, I would say because if we don't, then the code could get lost. If we don't, then someone else might be coding on our project and check their code in and our code is lost. And then they release that and all of our hard work is gone. I would say because it's industry best practice and Tanya will make fun of you if you don't. I mean, there's a lot of reasons here why you might want to do that. Nikki's like, I don't think the last one's a real reason.
No, I think it is a real reason. You know, social discouragement is a good reason for a lot of things that we do.
But it's true, right? Like, if I can socially pressure people to perform better security, like maybe I'm going to. Like not in a cruel way, but like in a gentle, like nudge kind of persuasion way.
We humans want to please.
Okay.
Generally.
So, yes. So I have another question. So we are on question 9 of 12 now. Why do we test integration points between different systems? Is it more or less valuable than testing the rest of each system? Do you want to crack at it or do you want me to do it?
I am good either. I could take a little crack at that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these integration points between different systems tend to be areas where risk could be introduced, right? Anytime you have to integrate two different things, there's like a fundamental kind of, they're not the same thing. So there's some sort of thing you have to do to integrate them. And that could introduce risks. That thing that is written could actually be problematic. It could have a parsing issue. It could have some sort of abstraction issue. It could have a lot of different issues. And those issues could introduce risk to applications. So
true. I personally think it's like equally important to test the integrations versus testing like the actual different applications. I think they're both really important and one's not like way more important. What do you feel on that?
Yeah, I agree with that.
I like it when we all agree. I mean, sometimes it's good when we disagree, but you audience members may find that Nikki and I agree a lot.
I guess we could disagree, but I agree with you on that one.
Okay, so here's one we could try to disagree on. Why do we test databases even though they aren't publicly accessible? The audience is open to answering these questions too. I will take this one.
Yeah, take it.
In my opinion, we have to still make sure that our databases are secured, that they're patched, that they're all these safe things because one, someone on the network may attempt to attack them. And two, because your application is a window into your database if the application is not secure. But if the application is not secure, but your database has been secured and is using least privilege principles, etc., it can either block or reduce the risk of the vulnerability in your application. And so whether you're protecting it from malicious insiders or you're protecting it from a potentially vulnerable front end, I think it's really important. Yeah, Tony's saying, I always assume the application could be compromised.
Yeah, I have a story for this one. When I was a pen tester, I had a application I was testing and I found SQL injection that was working and I was able to enumerate a ton of tables, a ton of data, start dumping data, users, etc. And there was one other database that was like other schema on the database that had the data I wanted. It was like usernames and password storage and all sorts of whatever. And I couldn't get there because they had a product called Audit Vault. It was an Oracle product. And this product segmented schemas by, it had good schema RBAC segmentations and restricting different schemas from talking to the others and this, that, and the other. And I just couldn't get into that table. And I was like, I want to get into this table, but the account I had, it wouldn't work. I couldn't escalate privileges. I couldn't get in. Anyway, but that is a good reason. I mean, it was a test, right? So this, you know, like we wound up fixing it. But the point is that if your application is compromised, and it could be, right? And if you have one big database, this is where the crown jewels are, right? Everyone has right? I mean, what do you have in the database? Is it just like fun facts? No, man, it's your data, you know? So
yes, 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 I agree so much. Yeah. So the next question is very similar. Why do we test APIs even though they aren't theoretically publicly accessible? This may be a trick question. Because APIs might be publicly accessible. They might have to be for them to work properly.
But I think you once said it the best, Tanya, around API testing. Like people, maybe you said this a few years ago, but you're basically like, people assume nobody's going to look at the API, right? Because it's like not a web app. It's just like this RESTful thing sitting back there that you could talk to and it talks back at you. It's a little under the hood, right? I think maybe over time people realize that that's not true, but I think it's a good point. Like it's not very visible. You'd have to like figure out that it's there. There's a little bit of homework you have to do to figure that out. Maybe, yeah, this much homework, yeah. But I think that's probably a reason why people have omitted that in the past. But why should you test it? It's a web app. It's no different than a web app. It's just not. It's spitting back JSON versus HTML, like it's or GraphQL, like whatever it's doing, right? It's just not talking over, you know, it's not talking HTML, but it's talking HTTP. It's just doing the same thing that normal web apps do. It just looks a little different.
Yeah, and you could send commands to it or get data out of it. There's like all sorts of badness that you can do with an API. Yeah, but I remember like when I started versus now, I feel like devs are taking the security of APIs way, 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 way more seriously. And I'm seeing tons of API security products on the market that actually are good and don't suck now. So that's exciting. Because I remember like the SOAP UI tester, and maybe it's better now, but I remember trying to do security testing with it and was like, I hate myself and want to die.
Yeah, it's hard. It can be harder, right? Especially this is where documentation becomes very handy, right? If you have a good API, a well-documented API, it's easy to test it, right? If you don't have a good API spec, it is hard. It is like, what is this thing doing? Does it talk which methods work? Let's try them all. Which parameters work? I don't know. What is it like to see? What's the structure? It becomes really difficult.
Kellen is saying, even if it's not public now, it might be later. It's not the dev's decision. And Andreas is saying they are public. Security by obscurity never worked. And yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last question is really tricky. And I would really like so I talk about the difference between a penetration test and a security assessment. And so penetration test is trying to find all the vulnerabilities, then exploiting them to making sure that they're actually vulnerable. While a security assessment tries to, you know, verify that your security controls work. There's like some checklist stuff going on. You do use tools, but it kind of depends. And you're trying to verify the security, but you don't exploit any of the potential vulnerabilities you find. And you report things that aren't necessarily vulnerabilities, just like this isn't compliant with our policy. And so when do we do one versus the other? And like any answer could be correct for this. And I'm hoping that some of the audience answers.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a different question, which we'll answer after. But thank you, Neka. Like, I would say if you need management's attention, you should get a pen test done. If you want people to get on board and know that there's something wrong, I would say like a security assessment. If like, so let's say you have an app and it's very delicate. It's very, very, very delicate. And like, let's say it's attached to a mainframe or something like that, or there's no dev environment. Don't do a pen test. Do a very, very safe and conservative security assessment because you don't want to knock it down and break it. Gary's saying, you do a pen test after a breach and the marketing team needs a good copy of it. Gary.
Well, I think your point is you get more value out of a security assessment in that scenario than you would in a pen test, right? Like
Yeah.
you know it has problems, right? It's an old app. Sometimes you know things have problems, and pen test might help you find problems, but you probably would find more problems doing a security assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it depends on too, like what the app is. So like, what if it's a SaaS product and you don't have permission to do a pen test on it, but you still want to verify that it's secure? Someone was asking me, because, you know, we are a secure, like, because SheHacksPurple, it does security training. They're like, you know, what security assessments are you doing, like on your academy, to make sure that our data is safe? I'm like, we are a 5-person team. I assure you, we don't have enough money to run a security assessment on the platform that hosts our whatever. Like, I read up about them. It didn't say there are any security problems. I actually met some of the team because I'm lucky like that. And I'm like, and I think it's good. I can't, first of all, I don't have permission to pen test it. But second of all, like, I can't afford to do a security assessment of all the different SaaS products that we use. I'm like, I'm sorry, guys. And like, where does that leave companies? And so sometimes you don't have permission to do a pen test, so you do a security assessment. Sometimes you have people on staff who are capable of doing one type of test and not doing the other type of test. Sometimes there's regulatory compliance that requires that you do a pen test or requires that you do a security assessment. Someone is saying security assessments is kind of like auditing, checking of compliance, and pen testing is best to do on risk critical apps. Thank you. I'm going to try to say your name, Puditha. That's nice. It's a nice name. Yeah, I feel like this is one of those it depends answers, and people hate it when they ask a really good question and then you say it depends. But sometimes that is the true answer, and that's what you have to do. There was one question from the audience that I was hoping that we could address before we wrap up. What's your thought on analyzing changes on new code for potential security vulnerability before the changes are pushed to production? Have seen AppSec teams providing the dev team with a checklist. I don't know if a checklist is the answer I want. There we go. I turned the ticker off. That's good. Look at me, all handling StreamYard properly.
So I think that's a good, the first sentence, like, yeah, I mean, if you are making, like, I think in the early on, we discussed like areas where there's probably high degrees of risky changes, right? Authentication schemes, session management changes, you know, these are areas where it totally makes sense on analyzing these changes before it's pushed to production. Totally makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in full agreement on that. And, you know, as long as the changes seem like they're critical or they're touching critical services, it probably absolutely makes sense to do this versus like, you know, oh, I'm just like changing the CSS sheet to go from gray to blue, right? Like maybe that's like not the same type of thing, right? Yeah, so.
I'd also say, like, for a checklist, I haven't really provided a checklist before, but I have provided like a secure coding guideline. I've provided like, you know, if you're going to make a web app, here's like security requirements for that web app, or like you're going to do an API, like here are the security requirements I have for that API. I would say that then I want to run some scanners on it. And hopefully if it's a really, really, really big change, like we could talk about it. Do you know what I mean? Like we could have a threat modeling session or a whiteboarding session if it's like a re-architecting of the app or a brand new app. But ideally, where you work, there's a secure system development lifecycle, sometimes called an AppSec program, where like there's certain steps that just happen, right? And so that means that the changes get set through those same steps that any app's changes would go through. Or if your app is higher risk, maybe there's more steps in the system development lifecycle for security than for a low risk app. But ideally, you have an AppSec program or a secure system development lifecycle. So like specific steps that happen every single time people release code or release an application. So I hope that answers your question, Neka. So with that, we are going to start wrapping up. And I want to ask, oh, someone is saying, check out OWASP ASVS and the OWASP cheat sheets. Yes, that is excellent advice, Andreas. I love the cheat sheets. And ASVS is good too, but I just love the cheat sheets more. So, Nikki, is there anything you want to promote, like upcoming episodes of the OWASP DevSecOps show or anything else?
Well, we have a few weeks off in August because it's August, and then towards the end of August, I'm going to pull it up right now. Actually, I'm wrong. We have a episode coming up on August 15th, handling software architecture shifts. Okay. So we have a meetup page, which we will put in YouTube. I will do that right now, nice. Where you could sign up and be part of getting alerts of when we have new shows, and they're really fun. We try to invite very informative and great guests to our show. Tanya's been on it many, many times, so it's a good place. I like it. It's fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's about it.
If you like this show, you'll probably like the OS DevSlap show. I have something to promote. The SheHacksPurple Academy is releasing our Azure Cloud Security course on Monday. And for 1 week, it will be $99. And you get an Azure trial for your lab time. So you can do the whole course and end up spending nothing on Azure. And like, we help you manage to make sure you don't go above your trial subscription. And so, yes, if you want to check that out, you can go to newsletter.shehackspurple.com and join our newsletter, and we will send you an email and be like, oh my gosh, it's ready. You can also follow us on Twitter at SheHackPurple or all the other places that people follow us. But the newsletter is the best place. And I'm just going to put that, I'm just going to type that out because I'm bad at this, newsletter.shehackspurple.com, and just like flash it on the screen for a second. Hopefully I spelled it right. Yes, I did. And so, yeah, that is happening. And then up next month, we will be doing chapter 7 of the book. And I honestly forget exactly what topic that. Oh, no, that's AppSec program. So yeah, I'm pretty excited for that. Thank you, Bloodthirsty. I am full of life. But so, yeah, I hope to see a lot of you next month. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming, Nikki.
Thank you for having me. That Azure course sounds great. I want to check that out.
Thank you. You definitely should. I am biased, but basically, like, you get to play with every part. Almost every single part of Azure except Sentinel. So Sentinel costs like $1 zillion. And I'm like, I'm just not willing to like pay a lot of money just so we could show it off. And you can't get a free trial on it. So we stick to the things to make sure that you don't have to spend a bunch of your own extra money for this learning purpose. But yeah, you get to do lots of fun stuff. And there's an XSS. Like, obviously, we're going to do an SQL injection. We're going to attack things, go investigate all the stuff. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, well, everyone, thank you for coming to Alice and Bob Learn Application Security, Chapter 6 with Nicole Becker and Tanya Jenka.
Bye, guys.
Bye.